This video is all about film photography in the ocean with the Nikonos cameras. Cameras are some of the best tools for film photography in the water. I'll show you how I use these to shoot action and share some helpful tips for surf and water photography. There are 5 versions of the Nikonos. Versions 1 through 3 look like this and they're fully mechanical with no electronic parts. Versions 4 and 5 look like this and they have auto exposure, built-in light meters, and a few improvements over the older versions. I like the older, fully mechanical cameras because they're built to last, and if you do flood them, chances are they're still gonna work. Don't be afraid to choose one of the older versions. They're less expensive, they use the same lenses, and the image quality will be exactly the same. Using the Sunny 16 rule never fails. When it comes to above water shooting, you have 2 lens options, the 35mm and the 80mm. The 35mm rarely comes off my camera. The wider focal length makes zone focusing a little bit easier to nail. If you're shooting the 35mm, you'll need to get a lot closer to the action to fill the frame, which means you're right in the impact zone. So if you're not quite ready for that, I'd suggest using the 80mm for more of a pulled back shot. You can kind of hang out on the shoulder and still get some cool angles. If you're strictly shooting underwater, you have a few more options, including a 28mm, a 20mm, and a 15mm. These are optically corrected for underwater shooting only. I plan to do an entire separate video on strictly underwater shooting because there's so much to cover, especially with using strobes and different lighting techniques. So in the meantime, if you are here for underwater photography tips, check out one of Jim Church's books. Everything you need to know about these cameras will be in those books. Choose at least a 400 speed film or higher. Occasionally, I'll shoot Kodak Gold 200, but only in the brightest conditions. The most important thing here is aperture. These cameras use a zone focusing system, and anytime you open up the lens wider than f8, it becomes really hard to nail focus unless you set to infinity. At f11, you can set your focus scale to be in the range of around 6 feet to infinity, which is indicated by the orange markers. And the white arrow in the middle is pointing at the distance for tack sharp results. On a bright, sunny day, shooting action, I'll use 400 speed, set my aperture to around f11, and I'll shoot at least 2/50th of a second, if not faster. At a 250 shutter speed with subjects moving across the frame that are close distance, you will get some motion blur, so it's best to use a faster shutter speed if you can and if you have enough light. The older versions like the Nikonos 3, they max out at 1/500th of a second, and the Nikonos 5 goes up to 1/1000th of a second. If you have the Nikonos 4 or 5, you can also take advantage of using aperture priority and letting the camera decide what your shutter speed is. When it comes to shooting action, it's always best to have control over the shutter speed. With the longer focal length of the 80mm, even at f16, you have a narrow range of in-focus areas. For the best hit rate, I'll set my aperture at f16 and the focus scale ranging from 20 feet to infinity. At a distance of 20 feet, you can fill the frame pretty well with an 80mm lens. If you want to focus closer, for example at a minimum of 10 feet, you can see the depth of field narrows to a range of only about 10 to 15 feet. If your subject falls outside of the 5-foot range, they'll be out of focus. So if you're tracking a surfer going down the line, you'll need to be really good at estimating distances to nail the shot. With these cameras shooting 1 frame per second, it's all about timing. Try not to fumble around too much with your settings when you're in the water. Once you set everything up, it's better just to focus on composition and point and shoot. When you're looking through the viewfinder of these cameras, it's only glass with frame lines. It's not a rangefinder or an SLR, so you won't be able to tell what's in focus. Just pay attention to how you set your zone focus on the lens. One thing I really like about the Nikonos 3 is in the viewfinder, you have frame lines for not only the 35mm, but the 80mm lens as well. And in the Nikonos 5, you only have frame lines for the 35mm. You can also get an external viewfinder like this for the 35 and 80mm. If you plan to shoot in the ocean, there's a few key accessories you need to have. First is a wrist strap. These cameras don't float, so you need some way to attach it to yourself in case it comes out of your hands when you get smashed by a wave. I like these Dakine fin savers, they get the job done. If you need something more heavy duty, there's a few companies that make better wrist leashes for larger professional housings. Check out Aquatech. If you're swimming in surf conditions, you absolutely need swim fins. I like to use DeFins because they're really comfortable. The last accessory is not mandatory, but it's a light meter. If you're using one of the older cameras with no light meter, this would be a good option. These are great for mellow conditions because you can wear one around your neck. In heavy surf, I wouldn't even bother with it. It just gets to be in the way and it's too large and hard to manage. I always take a few exposure readings before I head out in the water just so I can kind of gauge what the settings should be. When I'm out there, I can adjust the aperture, whether I need to open it up one stop or close it one stop depending on how the light's changing. Always keep your lens nice and clean and try not to put your fingers on the lens because it's going to attract grease and smudges, and it's really the easiest way to screw up your photos because after you dunk the camera and you lift it up, water will end up sticking on the lens. So give it a good cleaning before you go out in the water. Also, it helps to mount the lens upside down because it's easier to read the focus scale when you're shooting and you're looking down at the camera. If you like to shoot black and white film, try an orange or yellow filter to add some contrast. Most of these lenses allow for threaded filters. Maintenance is so important in keeping these cameras up and running. Now, this is not really a tip for shooting, but you really need to take good care of these cameras so you can keep shooting with them for years to come. After every session, you should be soaking the camera in fresh water. I usually clean my main O-ring because I shoot in shore break a lot and the sand always gets stuck in there. So use a nice clean cloth. Make sure you get all the sand and dirt out of your O-rings and then reapply a fresh coat of silicone grease before storing it away for the next session. You really don't need to fully detail your camera after every session, but pay attention to the O-rings. Try to keep them as clean as possible to avoid any chance of flooding. I know water photography can be really challenging, especially when you're shooting film at only 1 frame per second. If you stay patient, every now and then you'll get a good shot and it's totally worth the effort. Good luck out there. Thank you for watching. See you next time.